Oh, feet are going to get wet. There are lots of rules that runners tend to follow, as well as debates within the running community around things such as the best ways to train or ways to reduce injury. So in this video, I'm going to give 7 examples of things many runners believe that are either not substantiated by evidence, crumble upon analysis, or I just simply disagree with. So number 1, running on soft surfaces reduces injury risk. Now, I know of people who refuse to run on hard surfaces like concrete or asphalt. They'll avoid it at all costs, opting instead to run endless loops of grass ovals. But studies on this topic show mixed results.
And while running on hard surfaces like concrete or asphalt may slightly raise the risk of a bone stress injury, running on soft surfaces like grass or trails may actually raise the risk of a tendon or muscle injury. Why? Because when running on a softer surface, our bodies naturally adapt and we strike the ground with a stiffer leg. This places greater strain on tendons and muscles. So if you're someone with a history of bone stress injuries, maybe the grass is the best place for you. But if you're like me and all of your injuries have been muscle or tendon related, then perhaps the roads are a better surface. But another observation, and this is just my opinion, I've not seen any study investigate this, so take it with a grain of salt. And it may only be relevant to people in Australia, where we have endless numbers of grass ovals in the form of cricket pitches that double as AFL grounds. As previously mentioned, many people will run around the outer boundary for the entirety of their 30, 45, 60-minute run or whatever it may be, rather than place a foot on the harmful concrete. Apart from being incredibly boring, this seems to invite a whole host of other issues. These ovals don't have straights, and I suspect that always turning in a certain direction, whether that's left or right, cannot be an optimal way to train. Even if you switch it around at halfway to balance it out, you're still never running in a straight line, which means that you're bearing far more load laterally than you otherwise would. To me, this seems suboptimal in terms of targeting the kind of neuromuscular pattern you're aiming to develop. And ultimately, it's unnecessary. To quote Nick Gornick, a physiotherapist and doctor of physiotherapy, running surface might not matter as much as we thought based on the current research. Runners might be better off worrying less about their running surface and focusing on other variables such as sleep, nutrition, mileage, training intensity, and recovery. These factors have more substantial evidence supporting their impact on performance and injury prevention. Anyway, my feeling is that this received wisdom to run on soft surfaces stems from a time when people were running with a centimetre of shoddy foam beneath their feet. The shoes we now wear have 4 times the amount of foam, and so we're effectively running with a soft surface attached to our feet at all times. Number 2, you shouldn't do junk mileage. I've heard this so often from runners and coaches where I live down here in Hobart, Australia. It seems to be a hangover from the Sebastian Coe-inspired training of the 80s and 90s, where quality in the form of intense interval training was favoured over large volumes of easy running. There's a belief that doing lots of easy mileage is not only ineffective, but will also lead to poor running mechanics and ultimately place a runner at a higher chance of injury. People that espouse these beliefs are seemingly blind to the fact that every elite distance runner in the world, barring a handful of exceptions, runs high mileage, and the vast majority of that mileage is done at a very easy pace. Not only that, but the 90s, when low volume, high intensity training was at its peak, was the worst period of distance running for Western runners in the history of the sport. John Davis at Running Writings noticed this phenomenon and created this graph which shows the effect of low volume, high intensity training on high school mile times during the period. You can see that mile and 2 mile times for high schoolers in America peaked during the mid to late 70s when a high mileage approach was practiced. Then as a low mileage, high intensity approach becomes more popular, mile times begin to decrease, and they don't recover again until the 2000s when there's a swing back towards higher mileage. The renowned running coach John Kellogg had this to say on the topic. People like Horwell and Co. set back Western running 20 years. It took the advent of internet message boards and mailing lists to bring the truth about training straight from the runners of the 1970s to the aspiring runners of the present day. That has undone much of what was destroyed by low to moderate mileage running in those bleak years. We kind of take it for granted now, but I can remember a time when no Western runner other than Craig Mottram was competitive with the top Kenyans and Ethiopians in distance events. It was common for the top Australian, British or US runner to not finish within a lap of the lead East African pack in 10,000 metre finals during the 90s and early 2000s. And what were the top East Africans doing all throughout this period? High mileage. But it wasn't until the mid-2000s, when the pendulum started to swing back to the high mileage approach of previous eras, that we saw Western runners competitive on the world stage once again. And to address the injury concerns, there seems to be a heavy bias against volume when it comes to what people believe is the main source of injuries among runners. The prejudice against intensity doesn't seem to be as strong, but I'd argue that intense training is far more likely to cause injuries, especially when an athlete doesn't do high enough volumes of easy running to support this intensity. When we run easy, actually easy, we build our resilience to injury. Our bones become more dense and our tendons become stronger. Not only that, we become far more efficient as runners, and so high intensity efforts take less of a toll on our bodies, and we're able to recover much better as a result. I could talk about this topic for hours because it's a real source of frustration for me, but I'll leave that video for another day. Number 3, anything less than 20 minutes isn't a run, or anything less than 30 minutes has no aerobic benefit. I'm sorry, but this is just idiocy. Maybe the people that say this kind of stuff are joking, but your body doesn't work in absolutes like this. If all you ever did were 15-minute runs, you'd be better off than doing nothing. There's no magical barrier at 20 or 30 minutes where your body suddenly switches on and grants you the benefits of a run. And besides, there's a whole training approach that's been popularised on the website Let's Run called the Summer of Malmo, in which running short doubles is one of the key features. Under this philosophy, even just a 2-mile jog is seen as a relatively low-impact way of getting in additional mileage. If you do that 3 to 4 times a week, you're getting in an extra 5, 10, 15 kilometres, which adds up in the long term. And this provides a base from which you can gradually build. Anyway, it's proven to work incredibly well for American high schoolers. Number 4, you can't expect to race at a faster pace if you never train at that pace. I mean, it seems intuitive, doesn't it? If you want to run at a particular pace in a race, you need to train at that pace. This is usually done in the form of interval training, and maybe you'll get slightly more mechanically efficient at that specific pace by training at it. But if you're not using the right energy systems to sustain that pace, it's unlikely that you'll be able to hold it once you take away the recoveries. Why? Because the vast majority of energy contribution in any distance event is aerobic. And therefore, for large gains in distance running performance, we simply need to improve our anaerobic threshold. This allows us to hold faster paces with a greater contribution of aerobic energy. For example, the energy demands of a 10-kilometre race are between 96 to 98% aerobic. If my goal pace is 3:20 a kilometre, but to sustain that pace, 6% of the energy is coming from my anaerobic system, then that isn't my 10k pace. I won't be able to sustain that pace for 33 minutes. So what do I need to do? I need to improve my body's ability to utilise oxygen. And in my experience, the best 2 ways to do this are to 1, run more, and 2, do more threshold training. I can tell you that before running my 10k personal best of 32:24, which is 3:14 per kilometre, outside of one race that I did 8 weeks before, I didn't touch that pace or go any faster in the 27 weeks prior. In fact, I didn't do a single training session above my anaerobic threshold in the 17 weeks before that race. And yet, I was able to take almost a minute off my 10k personal best in that time and run a 5k personal best on the way through in that race. I didn't need to run at those speeds in order to race at them. I simply improved my anaerobic threshold by frequently training just below it and gradually nudging it up over time. In the race, I was still able to run above my anaerobic threshold, but because that threshold was at a much higher point, I required a much smaller contribution of anaerobic energy to sustain the eventual pace of 3:14 a kilometre. Number 5, injuries are just bad luck. Now, let me preface by saying that it's hard, particularly if you're a new runner, to know where the line is in terms of what your body can handle. Sometimes, despite being conservative and following all of the sound advice you're given, you can still pick up an injury. That's understandable, and just about every runner has been there. But if you're constantly getting injured, that isn't bad luck. That means that you're doing something wrong. Either you're miscalculating the load you can handle, or you're not adequately recovering from your training. If you simply go back to the exact same training and/or practices you were doing prior to the injury, with no intervention whatsoever, then it's very likely, in fact it's almost guaranteed, you'll repeat the same pattern. Our bodies don't get stronger than they were prior to an injury by themselves. So if you're constantly getting injured, maybe look at your training with a more analytical eye. What is it that you're doing that other successful runners who don't pick up constant injuries aren't doing? If nothing sticks out, then maybe look at your diet or sleeping habits. Are you eating enough quality food? Are you sleeping more than 8 hours a night, etc.? These tend to be the heavy hitters. 6. You don't stop in a race, therefore you shouldn't stop in a workout. Perhaps this is one of many Strava effects. That is, when people's running practices are influenced by how the run will look on Strava. If you don't stop on your run, then your overall pace for the workout looks faster in the Strava feed. I don't know, maybe it isn't. But all that aside, many runners seem to believe that stopping during their workouts will somehow destroy or lessen the training effect they get from that workout. I, however, would argue that when it comes to workouts, we should be trying to achieve the most amount of quality with a limited amount of load we have available to us. By jogging or floating the recoveries, we use up some of that load that we could otherwise devote to an additional quality rep. For example, let's say you're doing a workout of 6 by 3 minutes with a 2-minute jog recovery. Now that's potentially a 30-minute session, but only 18 of those minutes are quality. If you dropped the 2-minute jog recovery and shortened it to a 75 to 90 second standing or walk recovery, you'd maintain a similar physiological state, but you'd be able to perform 7 or maybe even 8 times 3 minutes of quality for roughly the same amount of load. Now, to make up for those few kilometres you'll miss out on by not jogging the recoveries, you could do a longer warm-up or cool down or run a little further in another easy run during the week. But the point is, you can do those kilometres when you're under less stress, when your heart rate's not ridiculously high, and when they don't detract from the overall quality of your session. That way, those easy miles come a little bit cheaper in terms of load, and you can perform more quality running in your workout. Now, there may be an exception if you're training for a marathon and you're preparing your body to tolerate the distance as much as the pace, and so training your body to cope with the added muscle tension and breakdown that accompanies a continuous run may be desirable. But for experienced runners, this isn't really a factor at shorter distances, and so when training for those events, muscle breakdown is something to avoid rather than something to seek. Number 7, you need to train with a group to get the most out of yourself. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't train with other people. If you're particularly disciplined and you train with others who are of a very similar ability to you and they're also very disciplined, then that's probably the ideal setup. Also, if you're the type of runner that needs the social aspect in order to stay motivated, then training with other people, even if it means you're not training optimally, is likely going to reap better results than an alternative in which you struggle to get out the door. However, in my opinion, the group setup is overrated. It tends to be great for the top 1 or 2 athletes in the group who dictate the intensity of each workout, unintentionally or not, and therefore train at the optimal intensity for themselves, but it's terrible for all those underneath them who are constantly overreaching in order to keep up. In my opinion, most athletes would see far greater benefits by training to intensities specific to their physiological profile. That is, doing threshold at an intensity just below their own anaerobic threshold, not at somebody else's. Doing easy runs at 70% of their own max heart rate, not at somebody else's, etc., etc. You get my point. As mentioned above, there can be benefits to training with a group, but the one most often cited is it allows you to push harder in workouts. From my observations, runners don't need help pushing harder in workouts. They need help holding back. And if you've always got a carrot dangling in front of you and your competitive instincts are always being stimulated, then it's much harder to do that. Anyway, that's enough for today. If you have examples of your own, feel free to write them in the comments and maybe I'll make a follow-up video in the future. But until then, remember, you can never take your hobby jogging too seriously.